Good morning from me, Tom, but I don't think it's morning for you.
Good evening, Simon. Good evening. It is. It's after 10 o'clock here in bonnie Scotland, but the sun's still out. It's been a lovely early spring day here in Scotland, and you're baking over there in Australia. Coming
Yeah,
out
it's 8 o'clock in the morning and it's 32 degrees here. And everybody gets up at 5 o'clock and goes out to do their business. You know, to go for a walk or go for a cycle or go to the gym before it gets too warm, because it's going to be a scorcher today.
Yeah.
But Brisbane is beautiful. Have you been in Brisbane, Tom?
I have not. I've been in many parts of Australia, but Brisbane's one city I've not been in, but I do hear it's beautiful. I've got friends that live there, and I hear it's lovely.
Yep. And I discovered another Manly. You were talking about Manly down in Sydney. And there's a Manly here as well. We were there yesterday for a bite of lunch at the yacht club, no less. I'm kind of living in your world a wee bit just now.
You are. I tell you what, Simon, when you come back, I can see you're going to be spending much more time in Edinburgh because you've moved up.
You mean they'll have me now?
I will have you. We'll have you all right. I will have you all right.
Can you get the warrants? Can you deal with those warrants for me?
Listen, Simon, I've got a couple of questions for you from the quiz book.
Oh, no.
Yeah, no, I know. Listen, I know things have not been so good for you recently, and you've not, so I've picked these specially, okay? So I think you've got a good chance of getting them. First of all, a murder. I think it was a Strathclyde murder, actually. You'll know of it.
We call them solved
Well, yes.
murders.
Okay. Well, okay. All right. Yes. Oh, sorry. Sorry. That was what you call a mirthless laugh. Yes. Okay. Anyway, the murder of Jorge Jenatsch. That's Jenatsch. Now, I think you would be around at that time. Jorge Jenatsch. And the question is, match the victim to the method. The murder of Jorge Jenatsch.
Any other clues? What year it was or anything? It doesn't ring a bell.
Yeah.
And probably your pronunciation's not helping it either.
Well, I'm doing my very best here. I'm reading it from a book. Jorge Jenatsch. I think you would remember.
What was the
if you had
what
any
was the
clue,
area?
you would remember it. Right.
Yeah,
Jorge Jenatsch was actually, I was being a little bit liberal with the truth, he was actually a 17th century Swiss politician. And he was killed by a man dressed in a bear suit with an axe.
Tom, I'm just glad when you said that I didn't say, oh yeah, the Jorge case, I remember that well.
Now,
never forget that one.
The thing is, you Strathclyders, you're full of BS, but you've never heard of that. A man dressed as a bear suit with an axe.
Goodness sake. And was he from Edinburgh? Is that where this is going?
No, he was a Swiss politician in the 17th century. But that's unique, Anyway, I've got one more question. I've got one more question for you, and you're going to get this one because this is a multi-choice. Okay, so I'm going to give you the answer, okay, and you've got to guess the question. All right. So the multi-choice answers. One is £500,000. The second option is £750,000, and the third option is £1.2 million. What's the question?
What is the pension of a deputy chief constable, ex-deputy chief constable?
No, it's more than that, Simon. No, come on.
You're not taking a wage cut for anyone,
no,
are you?
Certainly not. No, come on. What is it? Right. What's the question?
Obviously, it's crime related. I would hope it's crime related.
It's crime related, all right. Yeah. No.
I think the answer is 1.2 million.
No. What was the question? What's the question?
I think the question is, what's the biggest robbery we've had in Scotland?
No.
How
much? The question is, and again, this has not strictly come from the book, but I'm trying to help you. What?
You're telling so many lies this morning.
What was Simon McLean's average overtime claim per year?
Well, I got it right then. I used to work with a lad, he won't mind me mentioning him because he's going to come on the show sometime because he was heavily involved in Lockerbie. In fact, he went to Australia as part of the Lockerbie inquiry, but we'll cover that another time. His name's Michael Langford Johnson. And the first day in the Serious Crime Squad, I got neighboured with Michael Langford Johnson. And everybody was winking at me and nodding at me and whatnot. And I said, what's going on? They said, he's Mr. Overtime. Mr. Overtime. He gets signed on to every inquiry that's going. You'll make a fortune working with Michael Langford Johnson. So that first day, we were out and about. I can't remember what we were working on. And we came in at 4 o'clock and we signed off in the book. And I saw him sign off the book at 4 o'clock. He signed before me. And we both left the building together. And when I came in the next morning at 8 o'clock, he was there and he'd been there all night. He'd been on his way home in the car and had heard of a shooting in the city. And he phoned in as an AFO and volunteered to help out and arrived at the locus, and that was him all night. They never told me that he wasn't going to involve me in the overtime.
Now, that's what I call a machine.
So 1.2 million. 1.2 million was actually Michael's annual overtime bill.
Anyway,
that's a good one. I can handle those questions. Yes.
The deep dive team have done a super job for us again this week. We've got some fantastic.
They really have, and we'll need to get them onto the bear case. We'll need to get them onto that if it's real.
I can't wait to test them on the bear case, the bear with the axe.
Yeah.
I've got that in my head now. I mean, that's a wonderful story. That this true crime quiz book has proved to be one of the best Christmas presents I've had in many, many years. Not least because I can tantalise you with it.
Yeah. Well, sometimes when I phone, I get one of your family, and they tell me that as well, that it's kept you in your room engrossed. It's one of the best presents they've ever given you. Tom,
that may
deep
also
dive
be
team
true.
this week.
Yep.
We've got a lot of work to get through here.
I know.
So, Tom, our deep dive team have been busy this week. The first case, a Blue Mountains murder down Sydney Way. Beautiful part of the world. The only thing to impart about this country, as you know, is the scale of it. It's just enormous. When you talk about the Blue Mountains, it's unbelievable, the size of wild and bush that they have.
Yeah, I've been in the Blue Mountains, and I know exactly what you mean. Yep. I remember looking out on some sort of viewpoint over the Blue Mountains. It was just absolutely vast. And it is blue. There's this blue haze comes up from it. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So this was the case of Charlize Mutton, 9-year-old girl.
Yeah.
In the Blue Mountains.
It was very, it had a lot of familiarities, doesn't it, Simon? I mean, this poor lassie.
It's quite a recent case.
I know.
A recent case as well. So. 22.
That's right. I mean, what I couldn't figure out is what was the motive for the murder? I mean, she was shot several times. But no suggestion within the deep dive review of any kind of sexual abuse. But of course, the accused is a drug addict. So maybe it was a temper thing or whatever. But I mean, what a tragic set of circumstances. Once again, though, Simon, the key for me is, as we keep emphasising, it's easy to kill someone. It's not so easy to dispose of the body. And here we have it again. Yes, difficult to dispose of the body. Yeah, dreadful. Absolutely dreadful.
And that's where the evidence lies, is always with the body, isn't it? That's where the crucial evidence is found. Yeah. This is becoming an educational thing for would-be murderers here, Tom.
Well, I hope not. I hope what I want you to do is don't even think about it, because you'll get caught. Unless, of course, you commit your crimes in Strathclyde area, in which case.
Tom, something that came up in this one was this social media again. The debate about whether we should keep victims' details confidential. And it's always that balance for an inquiry team, for an SIO, as you were, in charge of an inquiry. What do you release to the press? Because it can be of great benefit to you to get the public engaged in the inquiry and get the flow of information that you require to sift through. And in the same hand, keeping something back that you don't want out in the public domain to compromise the case in future when it goes to court.
Yeah, it is. I mean, especially with a high-profile case where the press are on your back and they're looking for new lines every day. And to conjure up new lines every day is really, really hard to do. And of course, the temptation is to give away something that you don't actually want to give away. And so as things go on, if you've got a good press team who are able to keep the press interest, able to keep them off your back, able to stop them being a nuisance, but able to keep them on side and keep the information flowing, that's worth a lot. And actually, and keep the SIO out of it too, because the SIO needs to have a clear head to think about the investigation. The SIO shouldn't have to be going to press conferences every day, you know?
That's the senior investigating officer, Tom, just for our listeners that maybe not regular listeners. The thing about the SIO, maybe you could do that for us here, is just give us a brief overview. Because I see the SIO, I've worked with many, as a kind of puppet master. Pick a team and the right people for the team to fill the right slots and then let them go and do their thing and feed back to him or her. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think that's not a bad description, actually. I mean, the senior investigating officer is the person who ultimately takes the credit or takes the blame. And it's not all credit. They take the blame and the pressures can be enormous. But yeah, some SIOs I worked with, they were one-man bands. They wanted to conduct the whole investigation themselves and they didn't trust anybody to do a job for them.
Yeah.
But a good SIO will pick their teams well and then trust them to get on with the job. Hector Clark, my old boss, Robert Black, SIO, late Deputy Chief of Lothian and Borders, he was a master at doing that. He was a very good picker of people. And once he picked them, he would brief them and then he'd let them get on with it. And he was seldom disappointed because he picked the right people. And he used to come along and he used to ask questions and he used to cajole. And he was a very shrewd individual, highly experienced. But he knew, and particularly in the Robert Black case, when you had 5 different forces working, he knew that that was beyond his span of control and that he had to pick good people and he had to trust them. And he had a policy file, first man I ever saw a policy file. Here are the lines of inquiry. Here's what I expect of you. Here's what I expect of you. Here's what I expect of you. And that's the way he did it. Puppet master's not a bad idea. The thing was with Hector, and the thing you'll remember with good SIOs, you never felt like you were on the end of a string. You actually felt that you were privileged to work with these people. And the last thing in the world you'd have done is let them down. Because they had that aura about them that you didn't want to disappoint.
And they made each individual team within the team feel important and special, as if your part of the inquiry was very crucial. A bit like a football manager, Tom, or any kind of manager in any environment. You've got to make your people feel valued and respected, first and foremost.
You know, I was thinking about this the other day because I was in a company of former officers and we were talking about several things. And I realised it hit me then how lucky I had been and you have been in that actually, a vast number of police officers go through their whole service and never get to work on a major inquiry, who never feel that exhilaration of working in a murder squad, in a close-knit team, with a sense of purpose, in pursuit of the most serious criminals you can get. Because there's major terrorist stuff, I suppose, but I mean, murder's at the very top of the pile. And if you've been entrusted to investigate a murder and part of that team, then it's a huge professional compliment. It's also a personal responsibility. And I realised that I was sitting talking about it and realised when you're in the middle of it, you don't realise that. But I realised just how lucky, how fortunate I'd been, you know.
It's amazing that you bring that up, Tom, and we'll come back to it again in future because it's such a big part of the police is these teams we've talked about. The FBI's speciality, of course, that of setting up task forces.
Task forces, yeah.
We've talked about it before with the task forces that are set up. And what they're really doing is saying to a team, creating a team, a dedicated team of however many, And then the job of that SIOs was talking about is to bond that team. And once you get a team working, as a synergy kicks in, the sum of what they can do is much more than what the individual parts could ever do. And I remember sitting in briefing rooms and whatnot, when someone came in with a statement or with a piece of information that seemed as though it was, very often it wasn't, but at the time it seemed as though it might be the piece of the jigsaw we were all waiting for, and you could feel that excitement, and it didn't matter who brought it in, because we were a team, and that's why we were spreading the net as we were. So yeah, and I was fortunate enough again to move on and work in surveillance, which to me was the ultimate team experience, working in that environment. But again, we'll cover that again in the future. And we've covered that a bit in undercover and CTI in the past. I think the last word on poor Charlize was her mother. Just for the audience, her mother was a drug addict, and it was this relationship. It's usually that relationship that becomes the problem moving on with her partner, who ended up getting life without parole, which is a happy ending almost a happy ending as far as I'm concerned. The thing I wanted to bring up was the social media side of it, and the way the police caught him was through his digital track, through his digital trail that he left.
That's right. Yes, that's right. It was. And I have to say it was interesting because life without parole is not a common sentence. So clearly the Australian justice system thought that this man was an outrageous crime and he had to receive a very, very symbolic punishment and good riddance. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. The second one this week from the deep dive team, they moved back across Australia to Western Australia, where I was last week. And a name that will be known to everyone listening to this is Rolf Harris. And they made a good job. I think it was obvious the deep dive team don't remember him very well, but I do as a kid, Tom, and you will. He was all over our televisions in every shape or form. He really was a national treasure, is what they call it now, isn't it? And I would put Harris in that category back in the day because he was so talented. I remember the Saturday nights when he did the paintings with the brush strokes, the big giant brush strokes, and playing his didgeridoo, and he was number one in the charts several times with his quirky songs. And apparently he was a big hit on the student circuit back in the day, back in the 70s. He would play live concerts at all the universities and things like that, and he was a real entertainer and character. But it turned out that there was a lot more to Mr. Harris than met the eye.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I actually met Jimmy Savile, right? I met Jimmy Savile. And
what a party that was.
I also met Gary Glitter, but that's another story. That's another story.
At the same night? Anyway, on the same night?
Yeah, no, it wasn't at the same party. No. But, Jimmy Savile was obviously a creep. You could feel the hairs on your neck stand up. There was something. He was odd. But I never met Rolf Harris in the face, but I never got that impression for him. I mean, you take a look at Jimmy Savile and you thought, there's something very odd about you,
People now that weren't aware of Jimmy back in the day, because we were kids at the time, really, would look at him now and say, why did everybody not know he was a creep?
Well, that's right. Well, precisely. Well, precisely. I absolutely. But Rolf Harris didn't. Interestingly enough, of course, Rolf Harris was caught because of Jimmy Savile. Because when the Savile case was made known, they started this Operation U-Tree, and out of the woods came a whole lot of information from people, not just about Jimmy Savile, but also about other people who had offended against them. So it opened a portal, and there was Stuart Hall, remember, the television presenter, and Rolf Harris. It's interesting how when the snowball starts going, all you need is to scratch the surface, and out comes this level of reporting, and people who have been suppressing it feel able to actually pick up the phone and say, well, I never met Jimmy Savile, but here's what happened to me with Rolf Harris. And it was absolutely horrible because, at first I thought, well, is this sort of teenage girls, groupies and that stuff? But it wasn't. It was children, very young children.
Yes.
Absolutely horrific. Absolutely horrific. But
Do you think these guys, because of their fame and fortune, but because of their fame and this acceptance within the establishment, because these guys become friends with the royals, etc. Harris painted the Queen, for goodness sake, Queen Elizabeth.
I know.
Do you think because of that they think they're above everything? They can do what they want and nobody's going to say a word?
Yes,
because of the celebrity.
I think that empowers them, and I think they get away with things, and because of the power of celebrity. And we've seen this any numbers of times in the media, particularly, and I'm sorry to say, with the BBC particularly, because I mean there was creepy stuff that Jimmy Savile was doing that anybody would have smelled a rat. You know, wanting access to a hospital mortuary. Hang on a minute. What? You know, really?
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to figure that was something wrong, you know? I think it's entitlement, and I think they get away with it, and then I think it just goes to their heads, and they believe that they're invulnerable, and that's what.
Let's look at it from a police perspective, then, Tom. That only you can bring to this because of your high rank within the force. Mm-hmm. Because it's probably the question that the public have most about things like Harris and especially Savile, because apparently there were reports to the police. The same with Harrods, which is still ongoing just now. Apparently there were reports over the years. Why then did the police not say, two of you, go and have a look at that, interview those girls, interview those women, and see what's actually going on?
Well, that was done. That was done. That certainly was done in the Savile case. I mean, I know people who were pursuing Savile, but the truth of the matter is there just wasn't any evidence, and nobody came forward to lay charges against Savile in his lifetime. It all came out after he died. And the Mohammed Fayed thing, I mean, everybody knew it was an open secret. But you see, what he would do, he'd pay these young girls off. I mean, you're talking about early 20s, you know, attractive young girls. He would pay them off, and he'd get them to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and they would take money. And that's how he covered it up.
Yeah.
That's how he covered it up.
So what we really need to do is...
It's funny, I must tell you this little story. I got to know a manager of a big theatre in Edinburgh, and he'd been a manager of theatres all over the country, big theatres in London and whatnot, you know. And I said to him, so come on, I said, tell me, I said, you know, of all the stars you've worked with, who are the best and who are the worst? And he said, well, he said the best, he said, without question, was Harry Seacombe. You know Harry Seacombe, the goon guy. And apparently he was an absolutely lovely man. He said he was just such a nice man, unbelievable. And he named another 2 or 3 that I'm not going to name them because they're still alive, who were absolutely horrible in terms of their arrogance and all the rest of it. But he said the worst of them all was Daniel O'Donnell, the Irish singer.
No.
And I said, Daniel O'Donnell, why? He says, because he would never go home. He said, after the show, after the show, he used to sit down on the stage and all his fans would come round him. And he would call us up, the management, and said, can you get cups of tea for all these girls?
Girls.
And Daniel
O'Donnell.
on
their zimmers.
I know. Daniel O'Donnell would sit for hours. He was a lovely man, but he said, I hated him because you couldn't shut up the theatre. It was terrible.
My old granny-in-law, the kids called her wee granny, she'd be turning in her grave. She loved Daniel O'Donnell. It was an easy Christmas present. Present
it's not a story
granny.
against Daniel O'Donnell. He was a nice man, but from the point of view of a theatre manager, trying to shut up shop and get people away home, the fact that
I can't get over you calling them girls. That tells us more about you than anything else.
It does.
You know what's got 100 legs, grey hair, and no teeth?
No, go and tell me.
The front row of a Daniel O'Donnell concert. And you're calling them girls, but I know what you mean. You're a lovely guy. Lovely guy.
Yeah.
Good, Tom. So old Rolf, he died just last year, I think, Rolf. Good old age of 83. And he never, ever showed any remorse. I think a big part of his problem was his demeanour in court.
One of his convictions was overturned on appeal.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, he was still convicted. He never got out of prison. He died in prison. And I knew a manager of a very famous pop group back in the 70s, really famous. And he said that his biggest job was to get the boys in the band away, out of the way, and not let them get into trouble with any of the fans who were trying to break into the hotel and all the rest of it. He said, my heart was in my mouth, he said, because I didn't want any allegations of rape or assault or anything like that stuff. So he said, so I used to soldier them. I used to get them into a bus and get them away out the way. He said, because it was so dangerous. And he said, that was he said that was the most stressful part of his job.
Yeah. Rolf never had anyone looking after him like that. One of the things was his demeanour in court, Tom, as well, that he was a bit cocky on it, I think, in court. In fact, I think he broke into song or started playing his didgeridoo in court or something.
Well, he was very arrogant. The whole thing. That's right. Very arrogant.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that wouldn't go down well with the jury.
No, not indeed.
Who took their time to...
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, let's have a wee word from our advertisers there, Tom. I think that'd be good. The Reith lecture, Tom, this week, this is the last one. This was the fourth of the Reith lectures. And of course, I should mention that you'll be giving your own wood lecture soon in Airdrie. You've got some live gigs coming up. You've taken advantage of me being on the other side of the world and you've gone solo for a couple of gigs on your own.
Now listen, the first gig is sold out on the 3rd of April. But there's another gig on the Saturday, on the 5th of April, at the Airdrie Library. Lovely people, and I'm really looking forward to it. And I'll try and give you a little boost, if I can. I'll say a kind word about you, Simon, when I'm through there.
Well, I'd be available at 4 o'clock in the morning. I'll be available if you want to pipe me in.
Okay.
From Australia, just to entertain the crowd, just to lighten the mood, because you'll have them sleeping.
Yeah, listen, they'll be shivering their shoes by the time I'm finished with them. Don't you worry.
I'll need to get an old colleague of mine to come along, so you've still got someone from Strathclyde to slag.
You will actually. That's true. I need a scapegoat. I need a scapegoat.
Tom, the Reith lectures this week, it's the last one, and I've kind of kept my powder dry up until now, but the whole thing flies in the face of everything that we ever experienced as police officers with regards to, and I know that makes us dinosaurs and whatnot, because there are much more modern ways of thinking, but I'm not sure that they're conducive to murder squad detectives out there trying to catch these guys. But the whole thing, the phrase that got me during the whole thing was genuine remorse. I find that so interesting that she can say, oh no, this is genuine remorse. Because I've seen so many fake kinds of remorse, as you have, over the years.
They're remorseful because they've got caught. That's absolutely right. I think, though, there is something in this, though, Simon. I mean, let's face it. Our job was to catch the people and put them before the court, gather the evidence and put them before the court. But once they're in prison, then you really have got to think about rehabilitating them and changing violent minds. This is the whole tenure of the lecture, changing violent minds.
Yes.
Because if you don't do that, all you're going to do is store up trouble. You can't keep them in prison forever. You let them out and nothing has changed. And I mean, we've both dealt with people. I mean, the one that springs to mind for me, of course, was Angus Sinclair, the world's end murderer. He was put in prison for killing a wee girl. Nothing was done to try and rehabilitate him, and he came out even more dangerous than he went in. We have got to invest in changing violent minds. And okay, it's not our stock and trade, it's not what we were used to, but it has to be done. It really has to be done, because our prison population in Scotland is a disgrace, frankly. We've got more people in prison per capita than just about any country outside Mexico, I think. I'm maybe decrying Mexico, but I mean, it really is a disgrace, and we've got to get to grips with it. We really have.
I don't know about you, Tom. When I was a uniform cop, I always remember dealing with juveniles. It's a big part of police work, is dealing with juvenile crime, juvenile delinquency, we would have called it then. Just kids getting up to mischief. And sometimes it's for the first or second time that they've stepped over a line and got involved in something. Very often with a crowd, there's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of them, very often going along with the crowd. But the ethos for us then was very much, in fact, we had contact cards and things like that so that we all knew when kids were slipping down that slope. A big thing for me was if you could chat to the kid and get them to admit it, if they would admit what they had done and come clean and show some kind of remorse for it, then you always thought there's hope for that kid. We could maybe turn that kid around. It's the ones that would never, ever admit anything and wanted the lawyer, 13 years of age, they want a lawyer, they want their parents, they won't engage with you. And I think that's the key there, is to get some engagement at that age.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We did the same. And I mean, I remember when they brought in the reporter system, the Social Work Scotland Act as it was.
Yeah.
And they brought in and I thought, oh, this is going to be a soft touch. Actually, as I went on and I learned more, I realised that the longer you can keep a child out of the criminal justice system, the better it is. And I think I've said to you before, I mean, I used to say to my team of DOs down where I worked in one of the housing schemes, look, don't lock these laddies up because you'll remove the fear. Because actually, if you lock them up and they come out and they do it standing on their head because they're getting 3 square meals a day, they're getting a clean bed, it's not hard labour for them. And so the fear of incarceration was actually worse than the reality for a lot of these laddies. So keep them out in prison as long as you can, but keep the fear of it hanging over their heads.
Yeah, and try and get some engagement with them. Try and get to relate to them on some level. Because generally they're there because they've been mistreated or they've been ignored or they've been abused or just allowed to get on with it, if you like. They've been given too much leash at an early age.
Some of them have just been misdirected. I mean, I used to meet people and they were clever, they were courageous, they were good planners, but it was all to do with housebreaking. And I often used to think, if only your energies had been directed in a more positive way. but
yes, that's true. Yeah. I've seen that so many times. To finish up on that, Tom, the Reith lectures have been fantastic. And as you said, last week, I think, or the week before, what they've done is provoked conversation. Obviously, that's what we're doing. And thought. They've been very thought-provoking, and that's the purpose of them, I would suggest, is to get people thinking that maybe we could do things, and this applies to everything, that we could do things differently and get different results, because doing them the same all the time is only going to get the same results. So to finish up on the Reith lectures, it crosses your brows all the time, and sometimes you notice it and sometimes you don't, which in itself is an indictment. But men violence against women, and I take no pleasure in this, is even out here, I'm saying even out here, across the globe, men violence against women is a form of this violence and aggression that everywhere I go, we seem to turn a blind eye. We really need to pay attention to and look at changing men's behaviour, don't you think?
Yes, I do. However, I think it's a bad idea just to consider domestic violence, male against female, in isolation. I think it's one of the mistakes we've made, because I believe that all violence is connected. So if you get violence against a child, if you get public violence in the streets, domestic violence, they're actually all interlinked in a culture of violence. So I agree that we've got to educate men, but I think we should look at it as a whole and not as single components.
Okay, that's something we'll come back to, Tom, and I know that we've got things in the past that we've spoke about this, so it's a subject that we'll, no question we'll come back to, because it's a big part of our modern culture today. So our fourth deep dive this week was Frank, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, Abagnale?
Abagnale, I think, yeah, Abagnale. Yeah, This is the famous Catch Me If You Can man, the man who they made the film about.
Did you know him, Tom?
No, I'd never heard of him, but I knew of him.
I thought you worked for the FBI.
I worked with the FBI, but the FBI is a very big organisation, and I had no part in the Frank Abagnale thing. In fact,
Tom, do you ever get that? Tom, do you ever get that when people say to you, "Oh, you're a policeman. Did you know John Smith?
Yeah.
he worked in Aberdeen. You must know him. He was a big guy. He was a big tall guy."
I get it all the time. And they usually say, "Oh, I know the name. Yeah, that's fine."
Yeah. So Frank, he was a bit of a lad, wasn't he? But he worked full circle and got recruited by the FBI because of his skills as a fraudster and con man.
Yeah, but it's interesting, because he was.
Is that how you get in? Is that how?
Yeah.
Is that how you get into the FBI as well?
I'll have to listen. I don't like to talk. I don't like to talk about my association with the FBI. But one day, I'll maybe tell you the truth and tell you the story. But coming back to
that'll be a first.
Yeah, to Frank Abagnale, it's interesting because of course he was a check man. He was a forger of checks, and I was thinking about him and I was reading about it. Very few crime types have become obsolete, but forging checks is one of the areas that has. Because very, very few checks now are used. So poor old Frank, if he was still out and about and working in the area, and I think he's still alive, the man, he'd actually have to transfer his skill to something else because checks have more or less gone now altogether.
Yeah. I was interested, I know we're going to be focusing this year on digital crime, which you and I don't know much about, but which is a bit strange. But I'm learning as we go along. And this touched on our subject of digital crime quite strongly because he became a real expert with the FBI. For 40 years, he worked with the FBI. And some of the stuff that he talked about, what struck me was it sounded basic, the advice that he was giving or the things that he was highlighting. And that struck me, Tom, that this is basic. It's not something to be scared of, that you need to have a degree in computers or IT expertise. It's very basic to do with passwords and how you use your cards and how you... and we'll need to put together something for our audience that's and it will be layman's terms because that's all we've got. And it will be from the very simplistic angle of the basics, because that's all you and I would be able to impart.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. I think Frank, there was something about Frank Abagnale got me. He is one of two people in this deep dive section we're doing just now who reminded me a little bit of Johnny Rumensky, who we've decided because he was an exhibitionist. He liked to flirt with danger. And the crimes he was carrying out had a unique fingerprint. I don't mean a fingerprint, but I mean had a unique profile which could only be his. And of course, that was the case with Rumensky too. There was a kind of a need for notoriety, a need for recognition. There was something about that in the crimes of Abagnale as well. The other comparison with Rumensky was, you'll remember that a superintendent from up in Aberdeen actually made sure Rumensky got drafted into the army at the outset of World War II. Now, not only was he doing the commandos a favour in giving them a skilled housebreaker and a skilled slave breaker, but also, of course, what he was doing, he was ridding himself of a very active thief. And I can't help but think that the FBI were doing the same with Abagnale. Yes, he was working with them, but at the same time, if he was working with them, he wasn't working against them.
It's the old poacher turned gamekeeper, isn't it?
Indeed.
If you can't beat them. Tom, I should say for CTI listeners that Johnny Rumensky was a podcast and writing that you did the story of Gentle Johnny Rumensky, a brilliant story. What a character. And that was back in episode 13 in season 2. If anyone wants to listen to that, I'd highly recommend it, because he's the kind of measure. He's the yardstick for escapees for us, really, isn't he?
There was none better than him. None better than him. When I was researching him and I saw what he'd done, I thought, you've got to just sit back in awe at Johnny Rumensky. But of course, interesting story, interesting man. So many residences, and of course ended in tragedy, unfortunately, too, yeah.
Of course, but we'll not have any spoilers here. The final part about Frank was the big learning point for me of that story, and we're learning all the time, was you tend to have the FBI up on this pedestal, the elite and all the rest of it. Oh, they went to FBI school. It told us what I suspected all along, was that anybody can get a job for the FBI.
I'm saying absolutely nothing.
We'll have another wee advert there, Tom, just to let me laugh to myself. Our fifth case, second last case this week, and the last one you were talking about is where we were talking about escapees, but we'll come to that in a minute. First and foremost, I think of our 6 cases this week, this is the one that's best known and notorious in Australia of these 6 cases, because they tend to think of Rolf Harris now as British. I think they've disowned him completely.
Yeah.
Who? But Ivan Milat, the backpacker murders, a 3-year spree of backpackers, young backpackers. And the thing that came across was the viciousness of it, wasn't it? It was almost ritualistic, the way he was murdering these kids who were just travelling across Australia, looking to have some fun.
Yeah, absolutely horrible. And again, when you look at this, it's the old story. Once you find him and once you look at him, you realise that all the clues are there. You know, the petty crime, the sexual offences, the possession of weapons, and again, not a clever man, really. I mean, didn't hide, cover his tracks. I mean, he had stolen equipment. He kept a stolen rifle. He kept clothing. He kept trophies. He got away with it as long as he did because he lived in a very isolated community and nobody thought to raise the alarm. A horrible person. And you do wonder how many murders he was actually responsible for. Because, there's any number of young backpackers and people who have just disappeared into the wild. And you wonder how often.
And of course, he died without ever any confession or any remorse or whatever, which is often the case with these characters, isn't it? There was also a suspicion that he might have had an accomplice, but that was never established fully.
No, that's right. It sounds as if he might have had an associate, either to do with the kidnapping or to do with the disposal of the bodies, which is, as we've discussed, a difficult job to do. Horrible man, horrible person.
And he was captured with Paul Onions, the last one that he tried to abduct, who managed to escape from the car and raise the alarm. And then it all falls into place thereafter when the victims' bodies are found.
It all falls into place, Simon, because an ordinary police officer does their job. But, you were still very vulnerable because that young Paul Onions, he's escaped. He reports it to the wrong policeman in the wrong station, and it's treated offhand and the report's filed and nobody takes too much attention to it. We're still very, very vulnerable to that first officer. If we get a good response and a professional response, everything opens up. But if we don't, we're still vulnerable.
And that's true in every single instance. I know that our editor-in-chief, producer, whatever we want to call him, Chris, has done a lot of work on the Manson case. And that comes out very strongly there, the police first responders and how they dealt with the thing initially. But that's something we're going to be covering soon here in Crime Time Inc. Tom, our last case today was Darcy Duggan. And this is where the link came with your escapees, with your Johnny Remensky similarities. This was back in the 1920s in Sydney. This is the guy that escaped through the roof of the tram in 1946. A life of crime that started, he was never going any other way, was he? From 16 years of age, I think he had 90-odd charges or something against him when he was...
He was so like Remensky, you could just have changed the date. He was obviously highly skilled. He was obviously a career criminal. He was a prolific escaper who, I think, like Remensky, wanted to match himself against the authorities. I got that impression. It was almost as if his escapes were a performance. And he took pride in being a thorn in the flesh of the establishment. But the difference between him and Remensky, is that actually he saw the light at the end of the day. And unlike Rumensky, did not come to a tragic end, but actually, in the end, put his notoriety and his criminal knowledge to some good and became a rehabilitation officer, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Like Rumensky spent the majority of his life behind bars, 35 years behind bars. But yeah, you're right. And it's maybe appropriate with the Reith lecture coming to a close, our 4th episode of that today, that we've come full circle. And here is someone, a career criminal from the age of 16, never any likelihood of anything but being a criminal, including a murder that he was involved in. Mm-hmm. And here he is as an adult, after spending all that time behind bars, he decides to use that experience and become a rehabilitation officer. And it did seem like a genuine, if not genuine remorse, certainly a genuine effort to give something back to society, which he was successful
Well, that's right, absolutely. But interestingly, he was also like Rumensky in that you might remember from season 2, when Rumensky was in prison, he became a habitual complainer about the prison system. The meals were no good and the conditions were no good. It's almost as if he was desperate to stay in the limelight, either by escaping or by raising issues. The one thing he couldn't do was go unnoticed. And I thought Duggan was the same. But as I say, where they parted company, I thought when I read it, I thought this is Johnny Rumensky. This is an Australian Johnny Rumensky. But actually the difference was the end chapter, the finishing chapter of their lives were very different, because Rumensky, although he got chances, he could have stayed in Germany, you might remember, after the war and become an interpreter. But he recognised that he couldn't. And he said, I think he said, I've set out on a crooked path and that's the way I must remain, or something. Duggan realised that there was something more and actually turned his life around towards the end. So I thought that was interesting.
It's something that you've brought out in these podcasts, Tom, time and again, and we've kind of skipped over it, and we will again, but we'll address it again in the future, because we look for motive. People always say to us as police officers, how could someone do that? Why would someone do that? You've mentioned it today that you couldn't see the motive. There's always that underlying, why do people do these things? Well, I think you've added a strain to that for us here at Crime Time Inc., and it's very, very simple. It's probably the most basic of human emotions and instincts is looking for attention. Yeah. They want to be in the limelight.
Yeah. They're attention seekers. They want to be in the limelight, absolutely. And that's what drives a lot of these so-called notorious gangsters, you know. These people who seek the limelight and tell stories and all this. I mean, by definition, they're failures because everybody knows who they are. I mean, the most successful thieves are people you and I have never even heard about, you know.
Tom, we had an abduction, robbery. We'll cover it at some point. It was a security van that was compromised, and it ended up in a standoff in flats in Glasgow, high flats, 5 up, and the family were taken hostage, and we were negotiating. I wasn't involved in negotiating. I was armed and was at a stairwell. We had the place sealed off and evacuated and whatnot. But this went on from about 1 in the afternoon, and eventually they came out at 6 o'clock with their arms in the air, and it all stood down just after 6 o'clock. And what transpired was that they'd been waiting for the 6 o'clock news. They'd been waiting to see themselves on the telly. Simple as that. Oh dear! If we'd known, we'd have got the cameras there early and gave them.
Precisely. I must tell you the story sometime. We don't have time tonight, but I must tell you the story sometime about a shooting we had through in Edinburgh. And naturally, we suspect it was people from your neck of the woods because, you know, that's the kind of thing you do. But there was a real twist to the story. And actually, you're right. Sometimes it's for the most simple human needs that these things happen. But establishing the motive, why it happened, is a giant step towards solving the crime.
Yeah. And sometimes it's that most basic thing. Brilliant, Tom. Great speaking to you. And I'm sure I'll wheedle myself into this Airdrie gig somehow. I'll maybe just hang about. Because what happens now when I speak and people hear my voice, they say, oh, you're that Crime Time Inc. guy. So maybe that'll happen outside the town hall or the library.
I've already issued your photograph in your various disguises. I told the security team, but I always travel particularly in Airdrie, I'll be having my security team with me. I've told the security team that you're not to get within half a mile of the place, because this is going to be a high class event. Okay.
All right. Okay. Fair enough. Whereas the Mitchell Library will just bring us right back down to there. Tom, it's been great fun, and it's now almost 9 o'clock in the morning here, and it's 37 degrees. So I'm going to go in and get some respite and get my trunks on, and I'll speak to you soon. Take care.
Take care of yourself. Good night.